parents gave my $75,000 college fund to my sister. Now they've lost everything, and karma hit hard. Hello, read it. I was 19 when I realized that family didn't always mean loyalty. That realization wasn't a sudden, dramatic moment. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet kind of betrayal that crept up on me until, one day, I looked around and saw the truth for what it was. My name is Nathan, and for most of my life, I thought I knew where I stood in my family. I wasn't the favorite. That was my sister, Claire, but I was never the black sheep either. I was the responsible one, the planner, the one who followed the rules. And for a long time, I believed that counted for something. Growing up, my parents always had a way of making me feel like my place in the family was secure, even if it was clear that Claire shined just a little brighter in their eyes. It wasn't that they outright neglected me. It was just that she demanded more of their attention, and they gave it willingly. Claire had always been the center of the universe, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone orbit around her. She was beautiful, effortlessly charming, and had a knack for convincing people that whatever she wanted was the most important thing in the world. And my parents? They adored her for it. Me, on the other hand, I was steady, predictable. I worked hard in school, got good grades, and never caused trouble. I wasn't the kind of son who needed saving or extra attention, so I didn't get it. And I never complained. I figured that as long as I did what was expected of me, everything would work out. I would go to college, build a life for myself, and finally step out of Claire's shadow. I wasn't jealous of her. I just wanted something of my own. Our grandfather was the only person who ever made me feel like I had something special waiting for me. He was a hard man, strict but fair, and he respected effort more than anything else. He had built his own small business from the ground up, working tirelessly to make sure his family never had to struggle the way he did. He always told me that he saw a lot of himself in me, focused, determined, unwilling to let life just happen without shaping it into something better. Education is power, he used to say. You get an education, and no one can take that away from you. He meant it too. He had been setting aside money for years, building a college fund specifically for me. $75,000, carefully saved and invested so that when the time came, I could afford to go to a good school without worrying about debt. It wasn't a secret. He talked about it openly, proud that he could do something so important for me. When he passed away, my parents became the ones in charge of managing that fund. And because I had no reason to doubt them, I never questioned whether the money would be there when I needed it. I remember the day I got my college acceptance letter. It was a late spring afternoon, warm and golden, and I had just gotten home from school when I saw the envelope waiting for me on the kitchen counter. My hands shook as I opened it, the weight of everything I had worked for balancing on the edge of that single piece of paper. And when I read the words, "Congratulations, you have been accepted," I felt like I could finally breathe. That night, my parents congratulated me. Claire rolled her eyes but muttered a half-hearted good job. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had done something they were actually proud of. It was a good night. One of the last good nights, before everything fell apart. Over the next few weeks, I focused on preparing for the next step. I researched classes, started thinking about dorms, and got ready to have what I imagined would be the best years of my life. The only thing left to do was sit down with my parents and finalize everything with the college fund. I figured it would be a formality, just a conversation to go over the details before we transferred the money and made it official. I waited until after dinner, when the kitchen was quiet and my parents weren't preoccupied. I remember feeling strangely nervous as I sat down across from them, but I ignored it. I told them I needed to go over the fund, that the deadline for tuition deposits was coming up, and I needed to know how we were handling the payments. My dad barely looked up from his coffee. My mom glanced at Claire, who had been sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Something was wrong. At first, it was just hesitation. My mom avoiding my eyes, my dad letting out one of his long sighs like I was asking for something unreasonable. Then came the vague answers, the half-truths, the discomfort that made my stomach twist even before I knew what was wrong. I pushed, confused, and the more I asked, the more obvious it became that something was off. And then, finally, the truth. The money wasn't there. I sat in stunned silence as they explained, no, not explained, justified, why the fund was gone. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't lost. It had been used. And the way they spoke about it, the casual, dismissive way they brushed aside my shock, made my skin crawl. They acted like I was overreacting, like I was being unreasonable for expecting what had been promised to me. I didn't understand how they could sit there, knowing what they had done, and expect me to just accept it. I tried to ask questions, but they waved me off, telling me that these things happen and that college is expensive, but there are other ways to pay for it. My father even had the audacity to suggest student loans, as if my grandfather hadn't spent years making sure I wouldn't have to take that route. I wasn't expecting betrayal that night. I wasn't expecting to feel like a stranger in my own family. But that was the moment everything changed. The weight of their words pressed down on me, suffocating in a way I had never experienced before. My father continued to stir his coffee absent-mindedly, as if this conversation was nothing more than an irritating obligation. My mother kept shifting uncomfortably in her seat, sneaking glances at Claire, who remained sprawled lazily on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing of importance was happening. The world around me seemed to move at a sluggish pace, every second stretching out painfully as I struggled to grasp the reality of what had just been said. The money was gone. My college fund, the one thing my grandfather had worked tirelessly to secure for me, had vanished just like that. It hadn't been lost in some accident, nor had it been taken for an emergency. Instead, it had been invested in something, though what that something was I still didn't know. The very thought sent my stomach twisting into knots. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. For years, I had believed that my future was safe, protected by the foresight of a man who had seen value in hard work, who had spent his life ensuring that his family never had to endure the struggles he had faced. But my parents had taken that security and thrown it away. And now, they sat there expecting me to accept it, as if this was some minor inconvenience rather than a complete betrayal. My father's posture had the distinct stiffness of someone who had already made up his mind and had no intention of revisiting the matter. My mother, though visibly uneasy, seemed more concerned with managing my reaction than actually addressing what had been done. And Claire, of course, Claire had nothing to worry about. She had never needed to think about money, about consequences, about responsibility. Life had always worked out for her, one way or another. The anger that began simmering in my chest was slow and creeping. Not an explosion, but a steady burn that threatened to consume everything in its path. The room felt smaller, closing in on me as the realization settled. My grandfather's sacrifice, his years of careful saving, the dreams I had held onto for so long, it had all been disregarded. And for what? An opportunity? A gamble? A decision made without me that had now changed the course of my life? I tried to process the implications. College had always been the plan, the next step in a life that I had worked hard to build for myself. I had done everything right, earned the grades, put in the effort, followed the rules. The fun was supposed to be my reward, my launching point into a future where I wouldn't have to struggle the way my grandfather once had. And now, with one casual revelation, that future had been ripped away from me. It felt impossible to accept, yet the evidence was right in front of me, staring me in the face with the cruelest indifference. For a moment, I wondered if there had been signs, hints that this had been coming, that I had simply been too naive to see. Had there been late-night whispers between my parents? Strange financial decisions? Odd behavior that I had dismissed as unimportant? The realization that I had been blind to it all made the betrayal cut even deeper. My trust in them had been absolute. Never once had I doubted that they would uphold the promise my grandfather had made. But now, that certainly felt like a cruel joke. A slow, sickening thought crept into my mind. Had they ever even considered telling me? Or had they planned to keep me in the dark indefinitely, only admitting the truth when it was too late for me to do anything about it? The casual nature of their confession suggested that, to them, this was a non-issue. They had made their choice, spent the money, and moved on, without once thinking about what that would mean for me. The silence in the room was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that accompanied deep regret or shared grief. There was no remorse in it, no attempt at consolation. It was the silence of dismissal, of expectation. They were waiting for me to accept this, to move on just as they had. but I couldn't move on. This wasn't something I could shrug off, something I could adjust to like a minor inconvenience. My entire future had shifted in a matter of minutes. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I pushed myself up from the table, the movement slow and mechanical, as if my body wasn't fully under my own control. The air in the house felt too thick, too oppressive, as if staying any longer would smother whatever was left of the rational thoughts in my head. My mother called my name, but I barely registered it. I needed air, needed space, needed to get away from them before I said something I couldn't take back. Stepping outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, shocking my system back into motion. The sounds of the neighborhood, distant voices, the hum of passing cars, the rustling of trees in the evening breeze, felt like they belonged to another world, one that was continuing as usual while mine crumbled around me. I took a deep breath, but it did little to steady the hurricane of emotions swirling inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerless. I had always believed that if I worked hard, if I did everything right, life would reward me for it. But that belief had been shattered in an instant. Hard work hadn't protected me from this. Trust hadn't protected me from this. The people who were supposed to have my best interests at heart had willingly thrown me aside. And yet, as I stood there, staring out at the darkened street, another thought began to take shape. Beneath the shock, beneath the devastation, something new began to rise within me. A slow, burning anger. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night air did little to cool the fire burning in my chest. My breath came slow and deliberate. My thoughts no longer chaotic, but dangerously focused. I stood outside for what felt like an eternity, staring into the empty street, replaying every detail of the conversation that had just taken place. It wasn't just the loss of the money that gnawed at me. It was the ease with which my parents had done it, the complete lack of regret in their voices. They had never planned to tell me. That much was clear. If I hadn't asked about the fund, they would have let me walk into my future blind, believing the safety net was still there until it was too late to do anything about it. I had been nothing more than an afterthought in their decision, a footnote in a story that had already been written. But I wasn't going to let them dictate the ending. The first thing I needed was answers. Real ones. Not the vague dismissals or patronizing justifications they had given me. I needed to know where my grandfather's money had gone and, more importantly, whether there was any chance of getting it back. If they had truly invested it, then there had to be records, transactions, something tangible that could prove whether it was tied up somewhere or simply spent beyond recovery. I turned back toward the house, my pulse steady, but my resolve sharper than it had ever been. The living room was dimly lit, my parents still sitting at the table, speaking in hushed voices. Claire was still on the couch, her phone glowing in the darkness, completely indifferent to the storm brewing around her. As I stepped inside, they all glanced up, their expressions unreadable. They knew I wasn't done, but I didn't speak to them. Not yet. Instead, I went straight to my father's study, a place I rarely entered, mostly because it had always been treated as his own personal kingdom. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, and for a moment, I stood in the doorway, staring at the neatly stacked paperwork on his desk. If there were answers to be found, they were here. The room smelled of old books and faint cigar smoke, a testament to the hours my father spent holed up in here, handling important matters that no one else was allowed to question. I stepped inside, moving toward the desk, my fingers trailing over the surface until I reached the drawers. The first one slid open easily, revealing a mix of documents, folders, and loose receipts. I sifted through them quickly, scanning for anything that mentioned the fund. Nothing. The second drawer was locked. A bolt of frustration surged through me, but I had expected this. My father wasn't careless. If he had hidden the truth from me for this long, he wasn't about to leave the evidence lying around in plain sight. But the fact that it was locked meant I was getting closer to something important. I stepped back, my mind racing through options. I could confront him now, demand to see the records, but after the way they had dismissed me earlier, I knew that would be useless. They would deflect, lie, say whatever they needed to make me drop it. No, if I wanted the truth, I had to be smart. My father always kept his spare keys in the top drawer of the bookshelf near the window. It was something I had noticed in passing over the years, the way his fingers always lingered there when locking up something valuable. As I moved toward it, I kept my steps light, my ears straining for any movement from the next room. My fingers brushed against a set of small metallic keys tucked behind a stack of old newspapers, and a thrill of satisfaction ran through me as I pulled them free. The second drawer unlocked with a quiet click. Inside, a stack of legal documents sat neatly arranged. My eyes flicked across them, searching for anything relevant, until I saw a folder labeled with my grandfather's name. My stomach clenched as I flipped it open, scanning the first few pages. And then there it was, a withdrawal record. The entire $75,000 had been transferred months ago, signed off by both my parents. But it wasn't just a simple transaction. It had been funneled into something specific. My eyes locked onto the name printed at the bottom of the document, and a sickening realization settled over me. The money hadn't just been invested. It had been given to Claire. Every dollar. Not as a temporary loan, not as a strategic family decision, but as a gift. A business venture in her name, set up through some vague, newly registered LLC. The details were thin, but it was clear that my grandfather's hard-earned money, the future he had built for me, had been handed over to her without hesitation. A slow, pulsing rage coiled through my veins, but beneath it was something colder, something far more dangerous. This wasn't just unfair. This wasn't just irresponsible. This was deliberate theft, hidden under the guise of a family decision. I closed the folder carefully, forcing my hands to remain steady, slamming it shut, demanding answers, screaming at them. That would be too easy. If I wanted justice, if I wanted to undo this, I had to be calculated. The next step was clear. I needed proof, not just of the transaction, but of what had happened to the money afterward. If Claire had truly started a business, there would be bank records, spending reports, paper trails leading directly to her. If she had squandered it, then I needed evidence of that too. But most importantly, I needed to know whether there was any legal recourse to take back what was rightfully mine. The idea of going against my own family in that way should have made me hesitate. It should have made me feel guilt. But as I stood there, staring down at the evidence of their betrayal, I felt nothing but certainty. They had made their choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. The moment I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I had found it, something inside me shifted. It was as if I had crossed an invisible line, one that separated the person I had been before from the person I was now. There was no going back. The evidence in my hands had confirmed what I already suspected, but had been unwilling to fully believe. This wasn't just an unfortunate decision my parents had made. It was a deliberate act of betrayal, done in full knowledge of what it would cost me. And Claire, of course, it all led back to her. She hadn't just benefited from this. She had orchestrated it. My grandfather's money had been funneled directly into her so-called business, a venture I doubted had any real legitimacy. If I had learned anything about Claire over the years, it was that she was incapable of commitment. She jumped from interest to interest, hobby to hobby, never sticking with anything long enough for it to amount to something real. And now, she was in possession of $75,000. Money meant to secure my future. Money that had taken decades for my grandfather to save. I walked out of my father's study without a word, my hands in my pockets, forcing myself to remain calm. If they suspected that I knew the truth, they would do everything in their power to cover their tracks. They would gaslight me, tell me I was misunderstanding the situation, insist that this was what was best for the family. I wouldn't give them the chance. I needed a plan. The first step was ensuring that I had solid proof. A withdrawal record was one thing, but to fight this, to actually take action, I needed more. Claire's name had been on the LLC registration, which meant she had to have business accounts, financial records, transactions. If she had spent the money recklessly, there would be a trail. If she had never actually started the business, that would be even worse for her. I went up to my room, locked the door behind me, and powered on my laptop. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from focused determination. If I was going to do this, I had to move fast. I searched the LLC name, and sure enough, It had been registered 6 months ago. The listed owner? Claire. The registered address? Our parents' house. That alone told me everything I needed to know. A legitimate business would have leased an office, set up infrastructure, built a real foundation. This was nothing but a front. I dug deeper, looking for any signs of activity, a website, client transactions, reviews, anything. There was nothing. The only thing I found was a basic web page that looked like it had been thrown together in an hour, with placeholder text still on some of the pages. There was no branding, no listed products, no services being offered. The contact email was a generic Gmail account. This wasn't a business. It was a cover story, hastily put together to justify the money being moved into her name. I exhaled slowly, forcing my fingers to remain steady as I took screenshots, saved records, and compiled everything into a folder. The more I found, the clearer the picture became. Claire hadn't invested the money. She had taken it, and she had no intention of building anything real. The next step was trickier. Bank records. I didn't have direct access to Claire's accounts, but I knew one thing for certain. She was careless. She wasn't the type to be secretive with her spending, and if she had access to a large sum of money, she wouldn't be able to resist showing it off. My parents had always shielded her from consequences, which meant she had never needed to be discreet. I checked her social media, scrolling through her posts from the past few months, and there it was: expensive restaurants, designer shopping bags, spa days, weekend trips with her friends. None of it was out of character for her, but knowing what I knew now, it painted a much darker picture. The money hadn't been used for a business. She had spent it on herself, and my parents had let it happen. I stared at the screen, my mind working through the weight of it all. They had to know. There was no way Claire had hidden this from them. They had made excuses for her, convinced themselves that she was still working on the business, that the spending was somehow justified. But the truth was staring me right in the face. The money was gone, drained into Claire's vanity projects and reckless lifestyle, with nothing to show for it. I clenched my jaw, my nails digging into my palms. This wasn't just unfair. This wasn't just irresponsible. This was fraudulent, and I was going to make sure they paid for it. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The withdrawal records, the fake business registration, the screenshots of Claire's spending sprees, every receipt, every timestamp, every single detail that painted the full picture. I wasn't just planning to confront them, I was building a case. The idea of legal action had started as a distant thought, something that seemed too extreme. But the more I uncovered, the more it became the only logical step. My grandfather had left that money for me. It was meant for my future, and they had stolen it without a second thought. If I let this slide, they would get away with it, and I refused to let that happen. The moment I had enough proof, I reached out to an attorney. The first meeting was just a consultation, but the moment I explained the situation, I could see the shift in his expression. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a breach of trust, a misuse of inheritance funds, and potentially embezzlement. He laid out my options clearly. I could sue them, and I would. It wasn't an easy decision. The thought of dragging my own family into legal proceedings felt unreal, like something that happened in movies, not in real life. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. My grandfather had worked his entire life to build something that would help me, and they had destroyed it without remorse. They had taken everything from me. Now I was going to take everything from them. I scheduled a second meeting with the attorney, this time to officially begin the process. I had my documents. I had my proof. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. The moment the papers were filed, my world was going to change forever. And so was theirs. The day the lawsuit was officially filed, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just the satisfaction of knowing I had finally taken action. It was the realization that, for the first time, my parents were no longer in control. I had spent my whole life following their rules, believing that if I worked hard and stayed in line, I would eventually be rewarded. But that illusion had shattered the moment they stole my future out from under me. Now, the power was in my hands, and they would have to face the consequences of their choices. I hadn't spoken a word to them since the papers were served. My lawyer had advised me to keep my distance, to avoid giving them any opportunity to manipulate me or twist the situation in their favor. I followed his advice. Even when my mother started calling nonstop, leaving desperate voicemails filled with fake concern and emotional blackmail. My father, always the more composed one, sent a single text, cold, calculated, dripping with condescension. He told me I was overreacting, that families don't sue each other, and that I was making a mistake I would regret. I ignored them. The lawsuit gained traction faster than I expected. At first, it was just a quiet legal process, something contained within courtrooms and paperwork. But then, word started to spread. Extended family, old family friends, and even people in my parents' professional circles began whispering about it. My grandfather had been well respected, a man who had built his wealth through hard work, a man who had trusted his son and daughter-in-law to protect his legacy. When people found out what my parents had done, how they had betrayed his wishes, how they had stolen from their own son, their reputation collapsed overnight. I started receiving unexpected messages. My father's older brother, my uncle whom I had barely spoken to in years, reached out. He told me he was disgusted by what my parents had done and that if I needed any support, I could count on him. A few cousins messaged me as well, some in shock, others offering to testify on my behalf if needed. It was as if the carefully curated image my parents had built over the years was finally crumbling, and people were seeing them for who they really were. Claire, on the other hand, was unraveling faster than anyone. She had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one my parents bent over backward to protect. But now, faced with actual consequences for the first time in her life, she had no idea how to handle it. She tried everything, first pretending the lawsuit didn't bother her, then shifting into outrage, then full-on panic when she realized this wasn't just going to go away. She started calling me, at first leaving smug, dismissive messages about how I was making a fool of myself. But as the weeks passed, the messages changed. The confidence faded, replaced by desperation. She told me she didn't know things would turn out this way, that she had just trusted mom and dad, and that I was being unfair for dragging her into this. But I didn't respond. I wasn't going to play her games. Then the breaking point came. One evening, my lawyer called me. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that told me this was important. My parents had finally realized they couldn't win. Instead of fighting the case, they had offered to settle. But there was a problem. They didn't have the money anymore. Somewhere along the way, after Claire had burned through her share, my parents had tried to recover their losses. They had taken a risky financial gamble, a high-stakes investment in a desperate attempt to refill the hole they had dug. And it had backfired spectacularly. The money was gone, every last cent. Now, they were drowning in debt. The irony was almost poetic. They had stolen from me, believing they could rewrite my future to fit their plans. But in the end, their own greed had destroyed them. The parents who had once stood so high, so smug in their decisions, were now on the brink of financial ruin. The next few weeks were a slow, painful unraveling of everything they had built. My father's business took a hit. Some of his longtime clients, upon hearing about the lawsuit, pulled their contracts. My mother, once the queen of her social circles, was now an outcast, abandoned by the very people she had once looked down upon. And Claire? Claire crumbled completely. She had no savings, no backup plan, no one left to shield her from reality. The lavish lifestyle she had built, the designer shopping sprees, the weekend getaways, the expensive restaurants was over. She tried to keep up the illusion for a while, posting old photos, pretending nothing had changed. But it didn't take long before people started noticing. The invitations stopped. The attention faded. And for the first time in her life, she was alone. Then came the final blow. My parents, desperate to avoid total financial collapse, had to sell the house. The same house I had grown up in, the house where they had dismissed my dreams and stolen my future. Gone. They had no choice but to downsize, moving into a small rental far away from the life they had once built. It was poetic in a way, how the home they had sacrificed me for was the very thing they lost in the end. I took the settlement offer. It wasn't the full $75,000, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to prove that I had won. The day I packed my bags and left, I didn't look back. I moved to a new city, enrolled in college on my own terms, and built the life I had always envisioned for myself. Without them. Months later, I heard that Claire was struggling to find work. Employers weren't impressed by someone who had owned a business that didn't exist. She was bouncing between jobs, burning bridges left and right. My parents, meanwhile, were still trying to claw their way out of the financial pit they had dug, but their reputation was ruined. And me? I was finally free. For years, they had believed they could control everything, that they could dictate my future, rewrite my path, and erase my worth. But in the end, karma had done what I couldn't. They had lost everything, and I had gained something far more valuable than money, peace.